Welcome to One and All. This is Matthias 76. Together, we're going deep in the Word of God so that we are empowered, so that we are equipped and prepared to decode the deception that constantly surrounds us in this sinful world. We are picking up today in the book of Daniel with Daniel chapter 5. And just a quick reminder, you can go here on our website, which people are continually going out here to our website, got all kinds of resources. We're always adding to it, but you can come right here to our page on Daniel, and you can find all of our Bible teachings on Daniel, all the videos right here. So go out there, check it out. Would love to have you pay us a visit. So we are picking up with chapter 5. Now, one of the things that is important to note here is, and I alluded to this, I mentioned it in the last video, these kings come and go. And to the narrative of the book of Daniel, and really to the narrative of the true history of this world, understanding that history for what it is, that it is the record of God's action, his saving action, his action through which he preserves the church, creates, preserves, sustains, and eventually takes home his church. The waxing and waning of the kingdoms, the empires of this world just doesn't matter. It is the tapestry upon which God weaves his salvation over all of that. So whether it is Pharaoh or Caesar or Alexander the Great or Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or evil Nabonidus, they were co-regents, whomever it might be, it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. As great as they are in our estimation, and that applies to our time, our era, as great as the different players may be, they are but grains of sand. They are nothing. They are in the positions they are in. They have the power that they wield because God gives it to them. Why does he give power to evil people? It suits his purposes. He brings about his ends in spite of their evil. His grace and his mercy are greater than the evil that exists in this world, and he can use that evil. He can shape, guide, direct the events of history to bring about what he wants to bring about. So all of that in mind, we pick up with chapter 5 with King Belshazzar. Now, there's important note. There are different events in the Babylonian history timeline that historians and theologians, so-called theologians, said that the book of Daniel was wrong about. That many biblical scholars believe that the book of Daniel was written later on in the intertestamental period, meaning between 400 and 400 BC and the birth of Christ. They think that it was written as a way of motivating the faithfulness of the Jews and giving them strength and encouragement in the time when they were being ruled by the Ptolemies and Seleucids and others. That's not the case. That's not the case. It wasn't written after the fact, recording the events of history to suit the purposes of the author. That's not the way it went down. It was written at the time that it was written, much closer to the happening of the occurrence happening of these events. Terrible, terrible English. The occurrence of the events of which it informs us. But interesting, and history never reports this stuff. You know, they took the secular history that they had of Babylon and said, this stuff isn't mentioned. This part of the book of Daniel is wrong. They were just making this stuff up out of whole cloth. Then Archaeological discoveries are made, official tablets, records of the kingdom unearthed that line up directly with what the book of Daniel tells us, and not a peep, not a word. They don't say, wow, we really blew it. Wow, we were wrong. The book of Daniel is an accurate historical portrayal. They still try to do the same thing with Egypt. And all of Egyptology, with all of the history of Egypt that we have, and understand it's been buried in the sand for how long, there is no record of the Exodus. There's no record of any of those events. We rely on the Word of God because it is inspired by His Holy Spirit. He's the one who knows it all. I'm not going to rely on Egyptologists to tell me what happened in the Exodus, and I'm not going to rely on historians to tell me whether or not the book of Daniel is true. But again and again, and I'm just giving a couple of examples, things are unearthed, archaeological discoveries are made, and what the Bible said is exactly what happened. So, King Belshazzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, got to say the name at least one more time. King Nebuchadnezzar has been gone for some time when the events that are portrayed here take place. He'd been gone for some time. Who's King Belshazzar? Well, there was a king named, his name in history is Evil Nabonidus. Evil Nabonidus. He wasn't a good guy, apparently. He was off warring and fighting with the Assyrians and other things, and he left Belshazzar as his co-regent in charge of the province of Babylon. Okay, so historically, we're about 25 years after the death, the passing of Nebuchadnezzar. King Belshazzar is a king. He's there. He's in charge, but he's a co-regent. And that will tie in with other events of history that are not talked about here, but we have a clear record of that shed a whole lot of light on what goes on here in chapter 5. So King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, translate, he was buzzed, he was drunk. When he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and the concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron, wood and stone. We'll stop there. To plug this into the events of history, and we've got a lot of information from different historians, Josephus, Herodotus, others, what was going on at this moment in time. And we even know pretty much exactly when this event took place. It took place on October 15th, 539. Now, remember those numbers we talked about before, 605, 586. We're way after those things. But it took place then because what had happened, this was a big festival. Won't go into what the festival was exactly, although we'll touch on it later. This was a big festival that took place at this time, and we know this is when it took place because Nabonidus had been defeated. The Persians and the Medes had defeated him, what had been the Assyrian Empire. They defeated him, and at this time he had probably been captured, although history isn't absolutely clear on that. And the forces of Darius, or Darius, I've always called him Darius, I'm just going to keep calling him Darius. Darius were coming toward Babylon. Now, it wasn't like they were quaking in their boots. Babylon was a very fortified, defendable city. But these are the events that are playing out at the very moment that this is taking place, this festival. So, with that in mind, there are a couple of important things. The biggest being that he took these vessels that you go back, and if you look at Daniel 1:1 and 2, it says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand and some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. When we went through this before, we talked about how that was a way of showing the superiority of your God. You brought that God's stuff from his temple, and you would put it in the temple of your God. This was just a practice. It was just showing who in the polemical pecking order, where your God stood in relation to their God. It was a put down. It was a put down. Now, God allowed this to happen because he wanted these events to play out. He wanted Judah to be chastised, corrected, see the error of their ways, and then he was going to bring them home. And as Darius the Mede, Cyrus, who were going to let them go home. But it is a different thing altogether to take those vessels out of the temple of Marduk, that's who it would have been, Marduk, and have a drunken beer orgy with them. And that's what transpired. But it's more than that. That's kind of the simple level understanding. Their worldview was that the stronger gods enabled you to win wars. If your gods were happy with you and were more powerful, you would defeat the Assyrians, you would defeat the Egyptians, whoever it might be. By taking these things out and using them in this way, it is trying to remind yourselves that your God Marduk defeated this other god, and he can defeat other gods as well. It's almost a kind of worship that's going on, and much of the worship that went on was depraved back then anyway. But they're trying to bring these out to remind themselves of the greatness of Marduk and their gods and the pantheon of gods that Marduk had allowed them to defeat, and mustering the power and energy of all of them to resist the Medes and the Persians. Okay, that's kind of the cultural setting that's easy for us to miss because we don't think the way they think. Now, let's deal with the thing that it says his father. His father. He brought the king and his lords, the things that his father had taken. It was common parlance, just the way they would talk about things. It was done throughout many different kingdoms, even in Israel and Judah, that when you were the successor of a king, the other king would be mentioned as your father, even if he's a king that you deposed, as happened in Israel and Judah. Depose them, kill all of them, and still you would be referred to them as the son of that previous king. You're his successor. It's just the way they talked about things. So Belshazzar was not the blood descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. Doesn't matter. This is the way they talked about things. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood. This is quite likely, they're praising these gods, but these gods were likely gods that came from the different regions that they had defeated. Kind of like trying to get them all to come on their side and fight for them is a very possible interpretation of this. Okay, so that's That's the setting. That's the setting. It's debaucherous. It's inebriated. This that kind of is included in debaucherous, but it was a worship type setting in their minds, in their culture. Verse 5. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. And the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed and his color changed and his lords were perplexed. So the writing on the wall, that phrase, you can read the writing on the wall, it's there. And the writing on the wall, if you think about how you've heard that expression used, it's never in a positive context. You're not reading the writing on the wall that's talking about a great, grand, and glorious future. Nothing like it. It's always ominous and dark and foreboding. There's trouble coming. There's trouble coming. And that's comes directly from this, something that's carried on in culture in time immemorial ever since. All of that, remember all that I've just said about these different gods. And we're going to talk about, we get a little farther once Daniel speaks, we'll talk about gods and idols and all of these things and their view and understanding of that, because we can get confused. We'll come back to that. But these gods that they worshiped, these that in the form of idols, and they did not, I'll go ahead and jump into it because I have to. They didn't think of themselves as worshiping idols. They didn't really think that the golden statue was the god. They didn't believe that whatever it was the god. They thought that it was the junction point where that god would come and be there in that item, and they could speak to it, they could praise it, they could worship it. And that all of that thinking is kind of hard for us to get our minds around, but that's the way they thought. Why? Because they worshiped and believed in, even though they didn't think of it this way, deities, and we talked about that 2 episodes ago with the Watchers. If you didn't see it, go back and watch it. These were spiritual, divine entities, though they were lesser. They were created, which means this. They didn't get to do just whatever they wanted to do. Their ability to manifest themselves in physical form was limited by the God who had created them. There were bounds and limits put upon them. Okay? Now, and you can think about going through the scriptures, it never talks about these deities manifesting themselves in physical form where they could be seen, other than in some spiritual drug-induced type trance type thing. So here you have something different altogether. You have a hand appear, and that hand right on the wall. Now they have unearthed the banquet hall where this took place, and some of those images that you might have seen of blue tile with these representations of Marduk and the kings and others on those in gold, that comes from where they have unearthed this great big banquet hall. Okay, it was attached to the wall of the city, big grand, glorious place. But there were places in there, and this has been found in the archaeological record where they've found it, where there is plaster on the wall. Not all of it was tiled. There were places where there was plaster. Okay. And this hand comes and starts to write. And it's interesting. And I'm not able to read Aramaic. So, and this section is still in Aramaic, but the word for lampstand is a slightly different word than the common word for lampstand. So it would seem this was a special lampstand, maybe bigger, a central kind of thing in the arrangement of this room. Right there where everybody could see it, this hand appears and begins to write on the wall. And when you think of a finger writing on a wall, what comes to mind? You think of the tablets, the 10 words, the commandments written by what? The finger of God. For believers, there's a direct, that's got that connection to it. But it appeared and wrote on the wall in the king's palace opposite the lampstand. So it's in a well-lit place. You can see it, and it's in a central place, this special kind of lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And he gets scared and he calls everybody in again. Okay, same thing. You call the same group of guys and they're not able to read it. Now, here's the interesting thing that can pose a challenge in interpreting this. It's written in Aramaic. Why couldn't they read it? Well, what was written, and this is hard for us to get our minds around, Aramaic and Hebrew are very closely related, use the same letters, kind of like Spanish and English, use the same letters, but different words and use them in different ways. But a couple of things factor in here. They didn't write out vowels. So if the word, I'm not going to try in English, I'll just mess it up. But they didn't put in vowels. Those were put in later. Once these weren't spoken languages anymore, those who could read them created a pointing system with dots and dashes above and below the consonants so that people could still read it and know how the words sounded. Okay. Now, the fact that they didn't have the vowels, and also very often they didn't leave space between words. They didn't leave space between the words. It just looked like a nonstop connection of letters from margin to margin. Reason being, writing material was always precious. It wasn't like you could grab another sheet of paper and start writing again. It was precious, and they saved space. So these few letters that are here and the few words that are used, one of them repeated, they could have been a lot of different things potentially. And when the king is so these guys are brought in to read it. They all read Aramaic. They spoke Aramaic, but they couldn't tell with this tiny little stretch of letters what it was. When Daniel comes in and reads it, some of them probably said, yeah, that's what I thought it was. But how do you interpret it? It's one thing to read it. How do you interpret it? So even if you have a good guess that it says mene tekel parson, which is what it says, how do you interpret that? You got to be able to do that as well. So a number of things factor in. And again, some of those things that we have a hard time understanding or we need background on because we don't write that way. Even for me, I'm much better with Greek than I am with Hebrew. But when you show me one of the ancient texts, and you can find them online, I have to get a starting point and then read slowly and carefully because there's no space between the words. It is challenging. It's really challenging. Now, the queen, and who this queen is, the names don't matter because they won't mean anything to us. Possibly she's the queen mother. So she has remembrance better of times when Nebuchadnezzar was king. That's likely what this is. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever." Notice what she says. We've seen it before. We've heard it from Daniel. "O king, live forever." That's how you approached the king. It was like saying, "I'm here to speak. Please let me and don't kill me." Okay? It's a sign of respect. It's just what you did. "Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." Okay. So we talked before about the relationship, your father, the king, Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about that. But there's something that we'll just, if we weren't really looking at this and thinking, I want to make sure I catch everything, there's something that we would miss here. There's been a change. There's been a change. Nebuchadnezzar has been gone for some time, about 25 years at this point in time. Why doesn't this king, Belshazzar, know about Daniel? It would seem that Daniel has kind of moved back into the background a little bit. With his new reign, he doesn't have the clout that he once had. And I think just from what we see of Daniel in this book, I doubt Daniel cared at all. It's not, I heard something, a news story playing before someone else was listening to it. And I thought about the politics of personal destruction. What is it that goes on in the capitals of power in our world, whether local, state, or federal? Everybody wants to undo the guy who's higher than them so that they can take their place. And that's what we're going to see again and again. And it'll come up even more in the next chapter with Daniel in the lion's den. But Daniel had faded into the background. And you know what I think Daniel's reaction to that was? He couldn't have cared less. He couldn't have cared less. If this king doesn't want to use him in the same way that Nebuchadnezzar had, that's fine with Daniel, because ultimately, I don't think Daniel ever saw himself as serving anyone but his God. And he knew his God was the Lord of all, the ruler of all, King of kings and Lord of lords. So whatever his station, however he was serving, what he was doing, it was fine with him. And I know one of the things Daniel was always doing, he was always teaching as many as would listen to him about the one true God and the Messiah who was to come, because that's why we're here in December. That's why right after Christmas, what is it we talk about? The Magi, the wise men, the guys who came from this place, whom Daniel had instructed their school of the wise men centuries before. So Daniel was always being faithful. It didn't matter. And this is important. Don't focus on how the world perceives what you're doing. You don't answer to the world. You answer to your Lord. Don't care about what they think about you. Focus on being faithful. Faithful as a parent, faithful as a spouse, faithful as an employee, faithful in using your gifts being given by God in service to him. That's what matters. All this other stuff, it doesn't matter, because you know what? Belshazzar's about to get it. Nebuchadnezzar was only around so long, and when he got haughty and proud, he got humiliated and brought low. You know what? You want to avoid being humiliated and brought low? Just focus on being faithful and serving. God doesn't humble the humble. But he had in this time, in this reign, faded into the background enough that Belshazzar didn't even know who he was, didn't even think to call on him. Nebuchadnezzar would have picked up his cell phone and hit speed dial number 1. Boom, because it would have been Daniel. Not anymore. We continue. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought from Judah." You can tell he doesn't know who he is. He just got filled in on who he is. It's like when people go to the White House, before they go in, the president gets handed a little 3x5 card with a quick biography on them, who they are. You know, this is Mr. and Mrs. Whole Milk from Iowa. They're here to meet you, say hello, and be nice to them and ask them about how things are in Ottumwa, because that's where they're from. You know, otherwise the president wouldn't know who they are. And that's exactly what this reminds me of here. I have heard, because I didn't know myself, that you have the spirit of the gods in you, and that the light and understanding, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. This is Belshazzar's take on it. He doesn't believe in one true God being over all the rest. So he's just describing it in the terms in which he sees the interaction of the spiritual with the physical. Now, the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. Remember, I said they might have been able to figure out the letters, but what does it mean? But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. The purple thing, it wasn't easy to make things purple. It was the cloth of royalty. Purple was the most difficult. Blue wasn't easy. Purple was exceedingly difficult, so only royals would wear it. It was something that set them apart. And the chain would be something that showed authority. Okay, he's promising, I'll make you third ruler in the kingdom. And you got to wonder if Daniel didn't just think, oh, here we go again. Like, big deal. Like any of this means anything to me. He was so faithful. I think that Daniel, while he was always respectful and he cared about Nebuchadnezzar, he was genuinely upset when he saw what was going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar in that dream and the interpretation of it, and encouraged him to repent and change so it wouldn't happen to him. He was a caring guy, all that. But what I want to say is this: he wasn't intimidated by these guys. He wasn't intimidated. You know, when Paul was called before rulers and authorities, we're not told anything about when he appeared in Rome. That's not in the book of Acts. It's not in the biblical record. But I have to think that Paul was probably a whole lot like Daniel. He just didn't care. He was respectful because they're the authorities that God has put in power. He wrote that in Romans 13. He was respectful and gave deference, but he wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't afraid of them. Why? Because he knew whom he served. He knew whose he was. He was a servant of the Most High God. And I mean, that's Daniel 6 altogether with Daniel in the lion's den. But listen to Daniel. Go back, and what did the queen mother say when she came in? "O king, live forever." That standard greeting before you spoke and said anything else. "O king, live forever." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and your rewards for another. See, if we don't get in the context, if we don't understand their culture, their way, how things were done in the king's court, we just read this and think, he's saying, yeah, I don't need any of that stuff. You don't have to. No. Daniel, this is just me guessing. Daniel's disgusted. He's disgusted. He's seeing the things from his God, the sacred things set apart, made holy for use only for service to Yahweh by, Moses and Aaron, those guys. He's seeing them being used at a drunken frat party. He's not happy. There's no, O king, live forever. There isn't even O king. He just speaks. He's not impressed. He's not impressed. He's disgusted. Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. I don't want anything from you. Pretty powerful stuff. Pretty powerful stuff. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, listen with Belshazzar's ear. Listen. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. We read that. That's interesting. Yeah. He just said, my God, there's only one. There's only one true God, King of kings and Lord of lords. He who is and isn't created. He who created the other divine beings, the other spiritual beings, heaven and earth and all of that. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Without him, without Yahweh, without the one true God, Nebuchadnezzar was nothing. And he showed that when he cut him down like a great big tree and had him crawl around eating grass. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples and nations and languages trembled and feared before him, that great tree that grew and was over all the world. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. That's Nebuchadnezzar. He got to do all that stuff because the one Most High God gave him that power. He abused it. He misused it. They always do. He misused it and abused it, but it came from the Lord. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne and his glory was taken away from him. See, if it's my glory, you can't take it. If it's my money, you can't take it. If it's my house, you can't take it. If it's my family, you can't take it. The only one who can say these things are mine is the Lord. He gives me everything I have. He gave Nebuchadnezzar everything he had. He gave Daniel everything he had. The thing that makes Daniel so exceptional and such a model for us as faith is it seems that Daniel never forgot that. I do. I think of things as mine, my stuff, what I've accomplished, my intelligence, my whatever. It's not. If it can be taken away, then it's not yours. Important thought. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, his dwelling with the wild donkeys. Even his mind wasn't his. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, his successor, right? As far as kingship goes, he is his son. Have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Everybody knew this stuff. But you have lifted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Who is the Lord? He is the God whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways. Him you have not honored. His hand is your breath. In his hand, he's the one who determines how long you live. How much power do you have if you don't have control over that? And in whose hand and whose are all your ways? He's in complete and total control, and him you have not honored. Now, let's spend some time talking about this. You have praised the gods of silver, of gold, and bronze, iron, wood, stone, which do not see, hear, or know. Now, my Sunday schoolification, of which I had many, many years, idols are false. They're not really anything, all of that. That's not what this is saying. That's not what this is saying. And we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 8. And this is, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of the background, just enough to flesh it out. Paul was talking to the Corinthians, different age, different time, same stuff. All the food, all the meat in Corinth was sacrificed at a temple to false gods. Sacrificed before an idol. Okay. And Paul is talking to the Corinthians. What do you do when everything at Publix has been sacrificed to a false god? How do you to idols? How do you understand that? Okay. Paul's helping them understand how to work with this, how to live in this world. But he teaches some very important things about idols. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, the idol itself, and that there is no God but one. That's true. Listen to what he says, though. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, and he didn't put in quotation marks. In Koine Greek, there are no quotation marks. That is the editor. And as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. He just lays out there, and read it again when we're done. He just laid out there the difference between the God and these other gods. And remember, when they heard God, they just heard spirit being. There's a difference between the Most High God, who created everything, through whom we exist and have life and breath, and the spiritual world has life and existence. There's him, and then there's everybody else. There's everybody else. And if you go through, this Sunday schoolified idea that idols were false, that the false gods didn't exist, then why does God brag about defeating them and laying them low? That's like me bragging about my imagination beating up non-existent entities. It's nonsense. What all of this is saying to us is these other gods, they're nothing. Their ability to do anything is limited. Why? Because they exist. They're still here. Eventually, they're all marked for death. They're getting thrown in the lake of fire. But while they're still here, what they can do is limited by the one true God. They can't write on a wall with a hand that appears in front of you. Big differentiator. And I was going to say with that hand writing on the wall, when we talked about that, with that, we need to apply the if it's weird, it's important rule. Because a hand appearing and writing on a wall, it's really important. It's important because that's something only the one true God can do. And it's my assertion. It's my assertion based on all the things we know about these other gods and how they exist and what they do, that God limits their power. I mean, it's still less than his anyway, but he limits their power so that it is obvious to all that he is different, distinct, and set apart. And even going through the book of Revelation, and I am going to get back to it, even going through the book of Revelation, all of the events that happen, these evil things that go down, it happens with God's angels pouring out the bowls of wrath, God's angels blowing the trumpet, him opening the seals. Everything is under his control. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the Most High. Okay, then Daniel, we got to get to where he interprets this stuff. I scrolled back up. Now I got to find my place. Then, and one more thing, go back and watch that episode on the Watchers again. I encourage you to go back and watch it, even if you saw it before, not because I count clicks. And anybody who's on YouTube or BitChute who says they don't count clicks, they're deceiving themselves, and the truth is not in them, because everybody counts clicks. But go back and watch it again, not so I get another click, but because the information is so different. It's so new to our way of thinking. We need to go over it again and again so that we can incorporate it into our interpretation of the scriptures. Then, from his presence, the hand was sent, the Almighty God, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the meaning. This is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene. And let's hit this just real quick here. The literal saying is a mina, a shekel, and 2 halves. And all of their words, and our words do this too, it's just not as clear as it is with Hebrew. There were noun forms and verbal forms. Okay, there were noun forms and verbal forms. And so the noun forms is just a mina, which is a tiny little coin, a mina, a shekel, and a 2 halves. But the verbal form of that is to number, to weigh, to divide. To number, to weigh, and to divide. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. That's mene. And it's stated twice. Sure and certain. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Now, this, you've been weighed in the balance. I told you we know exactly when this festival was. And from other historical sources, we do have the date, but there's more than that, because this festival that lines up exactly with these events of the Medes and the Persians and evil Nabonidus being defeated and probably captured, and this big beer bash that they have in Babylon, there in the midst of the Hanging Gardens in this great big hall, it was in honor of Libra. What does Libra have? Scales, weighing. This was a part of their religious culture. So God takes this false worship that they're doing and uses it so it hits them right on the head. You've been found, weighed in the scales and found wanting. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and will be given to the Medes and the Persians. So you're judged. That's what the writing on the wall was about. Was there any good news in that? No, there wasn't. And interestingly, Darius, who takes over, he says that Babylon, the city of Babylon, fell, and the historical record shows a couple different places that it fell without a battle. It fell without a battle. And he, software's great till it throws you a curve. He says that Marduk let him have the city. That's what he says. So there was no resistance. There was no resistance. And if you think about it, he gives credit to Marduk. Now, it isn't Marduk. He gives credit to Marduk. But if you're getting ready to fend off this invasion, and this event goes down in the big banquet hall, and who was there? Everybody who was anybody was there. Who heard Daniel give the interpretation? Everybody heard the interpretation. And that's going to factor into what happens. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, Daniel didn't refuse it because he didn't want to die. But he had made it clear, I don't want your stuff. I don't need your stuff. It doesn't impress me. It doesn't matter. You know, and I always wonder, with the 24 elders around the throne, I mean, is it a symbolic number? Yeah, it's symbolic. You got the 12 tribes of the Old Testament. You got the 12 apostles in the New, but who really makes up the 24? I will be surprised for what that matters. I will be surprised if one of those elders isn't Daniel. How do you not put him there? How do you not put him there? This guy is just so, he's my idol. I want to be like him. That's a better way to put it. I want to be like Daniel when I grow up. That's who I want to be like. And my wife would say, well, you on the growing up thing, you still got a long way to go. And that's true. It's because I'm a guy. It's the way things are. That he should be third ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel couldn't have cared less. He went home and went to bed. That's what Daniel did. And that night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Do you think when everybody in the government, everybody who was anybody, all the wealthy people, all of that, when they saw this go down that day, that night, the writing on the wall, nobody could interpret it. Daniel comes in, he interprets it, and he says, you're toast. What does the writing on the wall say? You've been measured in the balances and been found wanting, and the kingdom is going to be taken from you. So then, when Darius and his mighty army show up, what do you think they did? They probably thought, well, we just lost the king. Nobody's in charge. Nobody's in control. The army might listen to one of us and they might not. And we just got told by the hand of God writing on a wall that this was going to happen. So you know what? Come on in. Let us show you around. The hanging gardens, they're really awesome. You're going to like it. Come on in. The throne, if it doesn't fit you, we'll get a new one. I think that's exactly what went down. Okay, we are going to stop there. We will pick up next time with Daniel and the lion's den. And if there's ever an account that we really have to work on Sunday schoolifying, it's Daniel and the lion's den. And then we start to get into some of the very apocalyptic stuff. But we don't want to think about the apocalyptic stuff in Daniel as we look at this image on the screen of the four beasts from his vision. We don't want to think of that as separate and distinct. The Holy Spirit crafted this book. He wrote this book. He inspired this book because all this stuff goes together. This stuff about the future of what was coming with different kingdoms ruling, with the end times represented here by this scary guy with all the horns and all of that. We are to understand that in the light of chapters 1 through 6. That God's in charge of all this stuff, no matter how it looks. I don't look out my window. If I look out my window, I see a tree. But figuratively, I look out at the window by looking at the screen and looking at the news and what's going on. And it can seem frightening. It can seem terrifying. It can seem as though, and by worldly standards, it is spinning out of control, just madness. And the older you are, I think the more you appreciate how mad our world has gotten. It is just insanity. But my peace comes in knowing that these truths that we see played out and made clear for us in the book of Daniel, they apply today. So if I'm going to say I want to be like Daniel when I grow up, then I need to pursue his thinking. He was never rattled by anything because he always remembered who the one true God was, and he always understood that he was in charge and that he served him. So everything's okay. Whatever happens, everything's okay. That's the mindset that I want to have, that I want to pursue. So when things disturb me, when I feel as though the world that I know is shaking underneath my feet and that everything is changing, I need to understand who's in charge and who's in control, no matter how it looks. And when I do that, then I am being like Daniel. Then I am being faithful, and I'm remembering who I serve and whose I am and what the end is. That is faithfulness. That is faithfulness, and we need to work at it. We need to prayerfully pursue it, that God would give us that mind, that we would look at the world that way, and we do that by being strong in his word. That is where his mighty power comes and affects us. Think of how emboldened, how encouraged, how comforted we feel when we read these things about Daniel. Well, if that's the case, then I need to do more of this and less funny videos about people falling down on the ice, right? How am I spending my time? And the degree to which the efforts of my growth are focused on his word, the more peace I'm going to have. We'll stop there. I want to thank you for listening. I pray this is a blessing to you. If it is, please smash that like button. Give us a thumbs up. It does make a difference. Subscribe. And when you subscribe, make sure you hit the notification bell. That way, it lets you know when we put out a new video. Share this video with somebody else. Put it out there for others to see, for them to hear. And finally, drop by and pay us a visit right here at decodingthedeception.com. It's a wealth of resources and knowledge. Go out, spend some time, click on the different things across the top, and right up here behind my face, you can't see it, but is contact us. You can go there, click, send us a question, send us a comment, give us some feedback. It means more than you know. This is Matthias 76. Together, we're going deep in the Word of God so that we are prepared to decode the deception. God bless and have a great day.